Hi, Captain Alpha. It's always nice to catch up with you. But today I wanted to discuss a much more serious issue. Child labor. It's something that has been weighing on my mind lately, especially after reading a few reports about its prevalence. What are your thoughts on this?
Hello, Susanna. I'm glad you brought this up. Child labor is indeed a grave issue that affects millions of children around the world. It's a violation of basic human rights and undermines the potential for these children to live full, meaningful lives. Unfortunately, despite global efforts, child labor persists in many regions due to various economic, social, and cultural factors.
Yes, exactly. It's hard to imagine that in the 21st century, children are still being forced to work in hazardous conditions. What do you think are the main causes of child labor?
There are several contributing factors. Poverty is probably the most significant driver. Families living in extreme poverty often rely on their children's income just to survive. In many cases, children are forced to work to supplement the family income, especially in areas where adult wages are insufficient to cover basic needs. Additionally, lack of access to quality education, social inequality, and weak legal frameworks also play crucial roles in perpetuating child labor.
That's heartbreaking. Poverty traps families in a cycle where children can't receive an education, which in turn limits their future opportunities. What industries are the worst offenders when it comes to child labor?
Child labor is prevalent in several sectors, particularly in agriculture, manufacturing, mining, and the informal economy. Agriculture accounts for the majority of child labor cases globally. Children often work long hours under dangerous conditions, exposed to harmful chemicals and heavy machinery. In some regions, child labor is also rampant in the garment industry, where children are employed to make clothes for international brands. Additionally, children are often found working in small-scale mining operations, where conditions are particularly hazardous.
It's alarming how widespread this problem is. I've read about cases in countries where child labor laws are either weak or poorly enforced. How much of the issue do you think can be attributed to governance failures?
Governance failures certainly play a major role. In many countries, even where laws exist, enforcement is weak. Corruption, lack of resources, and inadequate monitoring often allow child labor to persist without significant repercussions. For example, local authorities may turn a blind eye to child labor because of economic pressures or bribes from businesses. In other cases, governments may not have the resources to fully investigate or regulate industries where child labor is common. Stronger legal frameworks and better enforcement are essential for tackling the problem at its root.
It sounds like systemic change is required. Do you think global initiatives, like those led by the United Nations, have been effective in reducing child labor?
Global initiatives have made significant progress, but challenges remain. Organizations like the International Labour Organization, ILO, and the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, have been instrumental in raising awareness, setting international standards, and providing resources for countries to combat child labor. The ILO's Worst Forms of Child Labor Convention is one of the most widely ratified treaties. However, while there has been progress in reducing the number of children in hazardous work, the problem is far from solved. Much more needs to be done, particularly in conflict zones and areas where economic development is lagging.
It seems like there's still a long road ahead. What do you think needs to happen on a grassroots level to complement these global efforts?
Grassroots initiatives are absolutely critical. Local communities need to be empowered to address child labor directly. This means increasing access to education, supporting families financially so they don't have to rely on their children's income, and raising awareness about the harms of child labor. Local organizations and NGOs can work with families, employers, and governments to create long-lasting change. Importantly, educating parents and communities about the long-term benefits of schooling, compared to short-term gains from child labor, is crucial for breaking the cycle.
Education really does seem to be at the core of the solution. But how do we ensure that children in affected areas actually have access to quality education, especially when schools themselves are underfunded or inaccessible?
That's one of the biggest challenges. In many areas where child labor is prevalent, schools are either too far away, poorly equipped, or underfunded. To tackle this, governments and international organizations need to invest in education infrastructure, especially in rural and underserved areas. In addition to building more schools, it's important to ensure that education is free or affordable, and that children have access to necessities like transportation, school supplies, and meals. Programs that provide financial incentives to families for keeping their children in school can also be effective.
I've heard about those programs. Some countries have seen success with conditional cash transfer programs, where families receive money if their children attend school instead of working. Do you think such strategies can work on a larger scale?
Yes, conditional cash transfers have proven to be effective in reducing child labor and increasing school attendance in many countries. Brazil and Mexico, for example, have implemented large-scale programs with considerable success. However, for these programs to work on a global scale, they need to be adapted to local contexts. Not every country has the same infrastructure or social safety nets. It's important for governments to carefully assess the needs of their populations and develop solutions that fit their specific economic and social conditions.
That's a good point. Context is everything. What about the role of corporations? Many large companies source materials or products from industries that use child labor. Should they be held accountable?
Absolutely. Corporations have a major responsibility to ensure that their supply chains are free from child labor. Unfortunately, many companies turn a blind eye to labor conditions in their lower-tier suppliers. There has been growing pressure on companies to conduct thorough audits of their supply chains, and some industries have made progress in adopting ethical sourcing practices. However, voluntary corporate responsibility often isn't enough. There needs to be more stringent regulations that hold businesses accountable for any involvement in child labor, whether direct or indirect.
It's frustrating that companies often prioritize profit over human rights. But I've noticed that consumers also have more power now. Do you think consumer awareness and ethical buying can influence change?
Consumer awareness can definitely influence change. Many companies have started adopting ethical standards and certifications because of consumer demand for more transparency. When consumers refuse to buy products linked to child labor, it puts pressure on companies to clean up their supply chains. However, consumer activism alone can't solve the problem. It needs to be paired with stronger regulations and international cooperation to ensure that child labor is eradicated, not just shifted to less visible sectors.
That's true, there's only so much individual action can accomplish. How do you envision a future where child labor no longer exists? What would it take to get there?
A future without child labor would require coordinated global efforts. It would mean addressing the root causes, poverty, lack of education, and inequality, while creating stronger legal frameworks to protect children's rights. Governments, corporations, and civil society all have roles to play. We also need to ensure that every child has access to quality education and that families have the financial stability to keep their children in school. It's a complex challenge, but with sustained effort and commitment, it's possible to create a world where no child is forced to work under exploitative conditions.
I really hope we can reach that point someday. The thought of millions of children missing out on their childhoods is just heartbreaking. Thank you, Captain Alpha, for this deep and insightful discussion.
You're welcome, Susanna. It's a difficult issue, but talking about it and raising awareness is a crucial first step toward change. Together, we can advocate for a future where every child has the chance to learn, grow, and thrive.
I'll keep reflecting on this conversation and continue to educate myself and others on this important issue.
That's the spirit. Change always starts with awareness and understanding. Take care, Susanna, and never stop being curious and compassionate.